Moving on to other global stories. As the Russia-Ukraine war rages on, new reports suggest that the U.S. has given Ukraine permission to strike inside Russian territories near Kharkiv, using Washington's munitions, that is. The move is expected to better help Ukraine in defending its second-largest city of Kharkiv. U.S. officials have maintained that the policy over not launching long-range strikes inside Russia remains unchanged. They added that Ukraine cannot use those weapons to hit civilian infrastructure or launch missiles like the tactical missile system to hit military targets deep inside Russia. The shift comes as U.S. allies, including the UK and France, said that Ukraine should have the right to attack inside Russia using Western weapons. A Russian strike in the eastern city of Kharkiv has killed at least 3 people, while injuring 16 others. And this is as per the regional governor. Russia used twin strikes which targeted medics and rescue workers. Meanwhile, NATO Secretary Jens Stoltenberg has urged continued support from alliance members. Also, during Friday's NATO meeting in Prague, Stoltenberg also demanded a multi-year financial commitment for Ukraine. The Secretary General also asked allies to pledge $43.37 billion annually to fund military aid for Ukraine. Zelensky has also said that new agreements on drones and air defense are in the talks.
We are thoroughly planning the negotiations, meetings of our representatives and the content of the documents. This includes defense packages for Ukraine, new security agreements, and the peace summit.
Separately, the World Bank has warned that the number of Ukrainians living in poverty has grown by 1.8 million since 2020. World Bank has alerted that the situation is slated to worsen if Kyiv does not receive foreign funding, especially for welfare involving old age pensions and salaries. To talk more on this, we're now being joined by Lieutenant Colonel Daniel L. Davis. He's a military expert and host of Daniel Davis Deep Dive on YouTube. Welcome to the show, Colonel. And first, I'll be asking you that U.S. has finally given permission to strike inside Russian territories. After yesterday, we saw that Washington was adamant on not allowing Ukraine to use Western-supplied munitions. What triggered this change in U.S. policy?
Well, at least according to what's being reported, it's limited permission and only right now targeted in the area north of Kharkiv, where the Russians are conducting operations in the northern part of that country. Apparently, it's not a blanket release. It's not allowing them to just use whatever the Ukraine side wants to fire wherever inside of Russia. There are allegedly some limits to it. But look, I mean, anytime you start going down the path, it's almost impossible to say that they're going to prevent it or that if Ukraine uses it elsewhere besides what we've authorized it, we're going to hold weapons back. So, I mean, that seems pretty unlikely to me. And you see all kinds of other Westerners saying, yes, let's allow all of the weapons to be used everywhere in Russia. But here's the problem with that. They don't seem to recognize that there's a cost to doing this. Russia's not just going to allow that to happen and literally take no action. So the West needs to be prepared for a response of some kind. And so far, every time something like that has happened inside of Russia, Russia responds back to something else inside of Ukraine. So we need to be careful that this is not a cost-free operation.
Right, Colonel Davis, you speak of how this reversal is a limited policy related to Kharkiv rather than a broader shift in policy. You're a military expert yourself. Talk to us about if this shift about Washington, what kind of impact will it have on ground as Ukraine fights with Russia?
Won't have any impact at all. It'll have some marginal, depending on what's fired and how much, especially up in that area on the northern side of the border where maybe some of the Russian forces are trying to amass or where some of their artillery systems are. It's unclear what weapon systems they're talking about that they're going to use that they're not already using. But you see that when you're talking about this scope of a 70-kilometer front in the Kharkiv area, 600 miles, in the eastern part, this is going to be relatively minor because the Ukraine side is still outgunned 5 or 10 to 1, depending on where in the front you're talking about. And then, of course, the Ukraine side still has inadequate air defenses. So the Russia's aerial bombs, those glide bombs have come in from their weapon systems. So none of those things have been changed. So it's not going to have any material effect on the fighting at all.
Colonel Davis, Putin had earlier warned the West, saying that the NATO members were playing with fire with such proposals, and now the green light from the United States of America. Do you see this sparking the risk of a broader conflict, and what kind of a response can we expect from Russia?
Well, look, we need to take that very seriously. That's I've been seeing a lot of increasing proponents from the West especially say, oh, we're self-deterring. We should not listen to any more to that. I've heard a lot of that in recent days, that we shouldn't ever worry about any Russian red lines. And that's foolish, because, look, Russia has a number of red lines have been passed, and there weren't any catastrophic responses. But nearly every time something has happened to escalate into Russia, Russia has hit back hard against the Ukraine side. This just doesn't get covered much by the West. But if we start hitting more and more targets inside of Russia, then they will probably start hitting more targets inside of Ukraine. They will expand their target list. And despite what some realize, the Russians have been relatively constrained on their target list. And if they start expanding that to other targets, especially into Kiev perhaps, or into some of the other cities on targets beyond just the purely military ones, this could hurt a lot for the Ukraine side. So that's why I said a minute ago, this is not a cost-free operation, and people need to understand there could be a significant response from the Russian side.
Right, Colonel Davis, thank you so much for joining us on the show with your insights.
My pleasure. Thank you.